So this chapter, we are going to be looking at arrays, lists, and array lists. All of these data types let you store multiple values under a single variable name. But the way that they do it is a little bit different. So arrays are used in all languages and they are typically strongly typed, which means that you need to know the data type. And in C#, you need to know how many items you are going to add to the array. And you need to know that number ahead of time. Because once you've created the array and you've indicated how many items you're going to store, you can't expand it and make it bigger. Okay, so you need to know the size ahead of time. We are also going to be looking at a list and an array list. And those are collections in C#. C# has a lot of different collections. We cover pretty much all of them in our next class in the sequence. But in this class, you get a little introduction to them. So the difference between the array and a collection is a collection is dynamic, which means you do not need to know the size ahead of time. A collection is pretty flexible. It will expand and it can contract. So in C#, there are two categories of collections. There are generic collections and non-generic. Generic collections are strongly typed, and that just means that you will be storing values that are the same data type. So when we create a list, what we are storing has to be the same data type, but it's got that flexibility built in that we can make the list bigger or smaller, and it expands and contracts, which arrays do not do. We will also be looking at a non-generic collection called an array list. And the array list probably has the most flexibility because it expands and contracts, but it also lets you store values that are different data types. However, there are some disadvantages to using array lists, and we will kind of take a look at that. So first, we are going to talk about arrays. And arrays let you store multiple values under one variable name. And that comes in really handy because if you wanted to store, let's say you were going to balance your checkbook and you wanted to store all of the checks that you had written. Well, you don't want to have to declare check 1, check 2, check 3, check 4. I mean, depending on how many checks you write, you could have a lot. So an array would let you create a check array, and then you would just add each of those check values to the array. So we don't have to declare like 50 different variables. Okay, so we can store all 50 values under one name. So that is the advantage of using arrays. Now, to use an array, you have to declare the array. And to do that, you are going to give it the data type. You're going to give it a set of brackets. And the brackets is how C# knows that it is an array. And then you're going to give it a name. So I've got an example. If I was going to do a string array, I would have string with the brackets and then the name of the array. Golf scores, I that would be double, and I've got the brackets. The name of the array is golf score. Here, if I was going to store students' grades, I might have it as a character and call it letter grade. Declaring the array tells the program about it, but it doesn't actually create the array object or reserve the space in memory. Okay, it's just basically giving the program a little heads up that, hey, I might be using this. To actually create the array object, we have to use the new qualifier. Okay, and when we use the new qualifier, we have to give it the size of the array. Once we use the new qualifier and we give it the size, then C# knows how much space it's going to use in memory. Okay, and when we use that new keyword and we give it the size, that is called instantiating the array object. So what we do to instantiate is we take the array name, we set that equal to the keyword new, and then whatever data type the array is, and then in the brackets, we give it the size. So in the previous example, we had a string with the brackets and sentence. And so now if we actually are going to use sentence, we have to say sentence equals new string and give it a size. Golf score was another one that we had. So we would say golf score equals new double, and 50 would be the maximum number of golf scores that we could enter. And then here you see letter grade equals new character, and we've got 10. So that means we can only add 10 letter grades. Now, quite often, the declaring of the array and instantiating happens at the same time. You can do it separately, or you can do it in one step. Okay? And I guess that really depends on if you know the size. If you know the size, then it kind of makes sense to do it all in one step. But depending on what you're doing in your code, you may not know the size until later on down in the program. So if you know the size, you can declare and instantiate it at the same time. And so to do that, you would give it the data type in the brackets. You would give the array the name, set that equal to new with that same data type. And in the brackets, you have to put the size. Okay, so for the sentence array, we'd say string, sentence equals new string, give it the size. We do the same thing with golf and the same thing with letter grade. Once you have declared the array and you have instantiated it, which means you have actually created an array object and reserved the space in memory, it needs to store the values. Okay, then you can start placing data into your array. And there's a couple different ways you can do that. You can initialize the array, which will put some values into it when it's created. Or you can use data entry and have the user start adding values to the array, or you can just use assignment statements. One kind of key point is that the compiler is going to initialize the array elements to a starting value. And if it's a numeric array, it's going to initialize all of the elements, which means that all of these 50 locations are going to get initialized to 0. Okay? And for a letter grade, all of these 10 locations are going to get initialized to spaces. And same with the string. So all of these 200 locations are going to be initialized to a space. And it does that by default. Now, as far as initializing the arrays, this is one of the ways that we can get data into our array. Initializing has to happen when you instantiate the array. So when you use the new keyword and you give it the data type and the size, if you want to put values into the array at that time, you have to use curly braces, and then you enter each value with the comma in between. Right? And then you've got a semicolon at the end. And you do not need to fill up the array. So the one with the golf scores had 50. If I didn't have 50 golf scores to enter, I mean, I could enter 5 scores or initialize 5 scores or 10 scores, and that would be fine. Okay, it's just going to fill up the beginning with whatever you initialize it to. In this little example, I have an array that is 5 long, and I went ahead and put 5 values in. Okay, so you never have to put all of the values in the array when you're initializing. Once you have values in the array, how do you get them out? Well, you have to index into the array. And the very first element in the array, okay, that's what we call the first item that we stored, call it an element. The very first element in the array has an index value of 0. Okay, and the last element has an index value of the total number of items minus 1, because we start indexing at 0. So if we had an array with 9 items, we would have to access the first one with a 0. Okay, and the last one then, we would use an 8 to index in. Okay, so we would have the values 0 through 8. In our little example that we've got up here, where I added 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, here are my values. Okay, and I have to start indexing at 0. So if I index in at 0, I can retrieve the 10. If I index in at 1, I can retrieve the 20. Likewise, if I index in at 4, I can retrieve the 50. But these are the only values that I can use to access the data. So my array length is 5, which means my lower bound is 0, and my upper bound is 4. Okay, 5 minus 1. And to index into the array, all you need to do is use the array name, and then in brackets, you give it your index number. Okay, and then it will retrieve the value that is stored. If you want to put a different value into the array, it's a similar process, but you would index into the array and use an assignment statement. So if I wanted to put the value 30 here, I'd have to index in at 0 and assign 30 to it. If I want to just retrieve something to print it, again, indexing in at the location that I want to retrieve the value. So this would retrieve the third value in that array, because the first one has an index of 0. So we got 0, 1, 2, I would get the third value. Okay, so if we go back and take a look, This is 0, this is 1, this is 2. So that would print out the number 30. So whether or not you initialize an array when you create the array is totally up to you as the programmer. You can actually put values into the array at any time. So here I've created a favorite color array. It's a string array, and it has a size of 6. Okay, and if I want to assign values, I could say index in with a 0, put in the color orange, index in at 1 and put in the color green, index in at 2 and put in the color yellow. Okay, and strings should be in double quotes. I'm not quite sure why that single one is there, but that should be double quotes. Okay, and so that is how you would assign values after the array is created. When we are adding data to arrays, or we are retrieving data from arrays, we often use loops because we know what the size of the array is. And if we don't know what the size of the array is, we have a length property that we can use that will retrieve the size. Okay? And so in loops, it's pretty common to have the array name dot length represent the number of times that you are going to go through the loop. Okay, and so the array name dot length is used to determine the size. Okay, and you always need to remember that the indexing starts at 0. Okay, and so the length property always begins counting at 1. So the length property is always going to return a value 1 higher than the number of actual elements. Okay, so here we are looking at favorite foods, and you can see that I've initialized it. And this is another way of creating an array object. And you might think, hey, you didn't give it a size. If you initialize an array and you don't give it a size, it makes the array big enough to store all of the values that you want to put in it. So favorite foods is going to be limited to the number of items that I have in my initialization list. So I put, let's count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I've got 8 items. That is going to be the length of the array. Okay, so if I use the array name like dot length, favorite foods dot length, it will retrieve 8. But if I want to access the values in the array, I have to start my indexing at 0. Okay, because pizza is stored at index 0. Okay, so if I ran this code, favorite food dot length would be 8. But you cannot index in with at position 8 because that does not exist. Okay, this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If you try to go for 8, that is beyond the end of the array, and you will get an exception error. So knowing how we index into arrays and knowing how length works, that can help us create a for loop. Okay, because we have our value that we are initializing, I for index, I equals 0, okay, because that's where we need to start indexing. And then we can say, stay in this loop while I is less than the favorite food dot length, because the length is one more than we need to index. So that works perfectly. And then each time we're going to add 1 to I. And this is a very common way of putting data into an array and retrieving data from an array. Okay, putting things into a for loop. There is a special kind of for loop that is designed to process array elements. And it works really well if you've got data in all of your elements. And it is a for each loop. So for each automatically iterates, which means it repeats through each element. And so all you need to do is use for each, tell it the data type of the array, give the array an alias. Okay, so this variable name here is an alias. While you're in the loop, what are you going to refer to the data that's in the element as? So we're giving it a name. Okay, and then you use the keyword in, and then you give the array name here. So how this works, and I usually use very short variable names here because it's just an alias for the array or for the element in the array. So let's take a look at an example. So if we had a score array, an array that had a bunch of scores, it's an integer. The alias that we're going to use is S. So while I'm in this little loop, it's going to go through every single element and retrieve the contents. And I can access those contents by using the S. And I do not need to index in because it is going through the array element by element and retrieving what is stored. Okay, so if, and this is the beauty of for each. If the score array had 10 items, okay, it automatically would go through all 10. If the score array had 100 items, it would automatically go through all 100. Okay, so, and if I want to display the contents of the current element that it's accessing, I just need to use this little alias. Okay, so in my score array, let's say I didn't fill it all in. Okay, so let's say I had an array of 100 and I might have entered 10 scores and I want to total them up. Well, then it's automatically going to go through all 100, okay, because that's what for each does. So in here, before I total, I want to make sure that the element is greater than 0. Okay, because it automatically initializes numeric arrays to 0. So every element is automatically given a value of 0 to start with. Okay, and so I really only want to total up the elements that have values in them. Okay, so if the S, which is my alias, is greater than 0, I'm going to add it into the total and add 1 to my score count. Okay, so that's just a little example of how you would use a for each. So we did learn about static methods in our last chapter, and you can pass arrays to methods as an argument or a parameter. It's like passing other variables, but in the method signature, you have to include the brackets because the brackets are how C# knows that you're dealing with an array. Okay, so here we declare our favorite food array. And let's say we wanted to pass that array to a print method. Okay, all we have to do when we're calling the print method is put the name of the array in there. Okay, so we're calling print string and we're just passing it the array. Okay, and then here is our little print string method. It's in the parameter list here that we have to indicate that it's an array. So this is where we give it the data type and the brackets, and then whatever we are going to call the array while we are in print string. So even though we're passing an array that's named favorite foods, when we are in the print string method, we are going to call it ARR, short for array. So in this print string method, we get this little squiggly print. Here's your list. We've got a little for each here. And so what it's going to do is it's going to go through every element in this array. And then to print it, we're going to use this alias S. So just console.writeLine S. We don't have to index in because we're using for each. Now I have additional examples. And it will be a link to a separate video so that will explain all of these examples to you. But I can go through a couple with you. So here we've got our first example. And so this is very similar to what we were just looking at. We have favorite foods. And we did not give it a size when we are instantiating it. So it's just going to make the array the same size as the number of items that we are initializing it to. Okay, and so then we do our for loop here. And so we set the index to 0. We're going to stay in the loop while the index is less than the favorite foods dot length. And then we add 1 to the index each time. And then you see here we are indexing in to get each item and to print it. And that is what it looks like. So this second example is a little variation, a little bit more user-friendly. And it's allowing the user to determine how many foods they want to enter. And then the user is actually getting to enter the favorite foods. So here we've got how many favorite foods do you want to enter? We are reading in the size. Okay? And the size has to be an integer. Okay, this is going to be the size of the array. Okay, and then we are creating our favorite foods array. And you can see we've got new string, and actually we should have put size here. Okay, so we would take the size and put it there. In fact, hold on a second, I'm going to fix this. All right, so now that is fixed. So we have the user enter the size, and because we are good programmers, we are going to make the favorite food array the size that they entered. Okay, and so this is how we do it. And then we can fill in the array using a for loop. And so we set our index to 0. We're going to stay in the loop as long as the index is less than the size, because remember, that's going to be 1 more than our index numbers. And then we'll add 1 each time through. And so here it's just going to prompt food number. And because I is the index and it starts at 0, we don't really want to say food number 0 equals, So we are just adding one here for display purposes so that it'll say food number 1 equals. And then the next time through, it'll say food number 2 equals. Okay, and that's just to display to the user. And then down here is where it's going to actually fill in the array. And it's a string, so we are just retrieving whatever they type with council.readline. Okay, and this will fill in the array. And then if we want to retrieve from the array, we could do another for loop, or we could do a for each loop. And so here we've got for each, the data type is string. I'm going to use food as my alias in favorite foods. So while I am in this little for each loop, for each element that I retrieve, I'm going to refer to it as food. Okay, so it will go through every element, retrieve what is stored, and display it. So here I had indicated I want to enter 2, I entered 2, and then it just displayed it back. So here is another example, and this is a golf program. And so here we're not allowing the user to determine the size. We are creating a score array that is size 20. And then we've got a little temp score variable that we set to 0. And so our for loop here is the index is set to 0. And our condition is score.length. We're going to stay in the loop while I is, or the index is less than the length. And the temporary score does not equal -1. So this is going to give the user an out so that they don't have to enter all 20 scores. Okay, and then each time we go through, we're going to increase our index by 1. So inside the loop, we've got please enter your score -1 to end. Okay, and then we're reading this in to a temporary score. And as long as that temporary score is not a -1, we are going to put it into our score array. So what happens if the temporary score is -1? Well, it doesn't go in our array. Okay, and then we come back up here, and this condition is going to be false because the temporary score would equal -1. So with that condition testing false, it's going to fall out of the loop. Okay, and then you can see we've got a total, we've got an average, and a score count. Okay, and because we're allowing them to enter fewer than 20, if we want to calculate an average, we are going to have to keep track of the number of scores they entered. Okay, and we set that to 0, and we're also setting the total to 0. So now we are going to use the for each, but the for each is automatically going to go through all 20 elements, even if there's wasn't any data entered into them. Okay, but because it's initialized to 0, we need to make sure that the element we're looking at is greater than 0. Okay, so the purpose of this for each is to total up the scores and count up how many scores were entered. Okay, so if whatever the element is storing is greater than 0, then we have a score, and we add it to the total, we add 1 to the count. Okay, so by the time we're done with this, we do have a grand total of all the scores that were entered, and we have the number of scores that were actually typed in. So we can do the division to calculate an average and then display the average back to the user. So this example is showing how to pass arrays to methods and return an array from a method. The fill string method receives a string in the parameter list, and then it returns the string to the main program. Print string method receives a string array in the parameter list, and it doesn't return anything. So we are dealing with arrays here. Okay, so we're passing and returning them. So let's take a look at what this is doing. Okay, so in our main method, how many items would you like to enter? We read in the size they type, and we are creating an array called string array, and it is going to be whatever size they type in. And then we have a method called fill string, where we are sending the string array. Okay, and so at this point, the array is empty. Okay, and then it's going to return to this point and it'll be filled in. And then we're just going to store it back into string array. So at this point, it'll be filled in. And then we are calling the print string method and passing it our filled in array, and it'll print it out. So let's take a look at what fill string is doing. So in our parameter list, we are passing it a string array. So it's got string, and then it's got the brackets indicating it's an array, and we're giving it a name. And so while we are in this method, our string array is going to be called ARR. We have a for loop setting our index to 0. Our condition is the index is less than the array length. I'm going to add 1 each time. And so this is very similar to the last one we looked at, where we've got enter item number. And because I starts at 0, we want it to display as a 1. You know, the next time through, we want it to display as a 2. So we're just adding 1. And then we are taking our read line, which retrieves a string, and we are storing that directly into our string array. Okay, so this is going to fill in the array. And then once it's filled in, you can see that we are returning the array. And our return data type is string with the brackets. Okay, so in the parameter list, we had to include string with the brackets, and we also have to include that for our return data type. And it returns to the point it is called. Okay, so then it's got the filled in array. We store it here. And then we are passing that filled in array to print string. And if we look at print string, it is not returning anything. Okay, but in the parameter list, it is receiving the string array. And so it's just printing out, here's your list. And we've got a little for each that will iterate through every item. And our little alias here is S. So we're just doing a console.writeLine, and we're printing out S. Okay, and so here is my items that I entered, and then here is my little to-do list. So this next example has 3 methods. The first receives a double array, and it returns a double array. It is used to fill in the checks that have been written. Second method totals the checks that were written, and it returns the new balance. So it receives the current balance, and it also receives the check array. Okay, and that's how it's able to calculate a new balance. The third method receives the balance, and it prints the balance. And if the balance is less than 0, it will also print a message that you are overdrawn. Okay, so In our main method, we have what is your beginning balance, and we are reading that in. How many checks would you like to enter? They are indicating how many they would like to enter, and then we are using that size value to create our money array. And you could call it your checkbook array. It could be really called whatever you want. And then we are going to take our starting balance and send it to print balance. So balance is just a double value. So if we go down and we take a look at print balance, it's bringing in a double value. And while we are in this method, we are going to refer to it as B, short for balance. You'll notice it doesn't return anything. And most of the time, print methods are not going to return anything because their whole purpose is to print out the data. Okay, so here we are printing your balance is, and we are printing out whatever value was passed to us and being stored in B. And then we're checking to see if B is less than 0. And if it is, they are overdrawn. We're telling them they need to transfer funds. And then we are returning back up to main. Okay, so that was done here. Okay, and then we are going to enter some checks. And we are passing it our money array. You will notice that it returns the array and we store it back here. Okay, so let's go down to enter checks. And the money array was double. So we've got the double in the brackets, indicating that it is receiving a double array. And we are going to call it my checks here. And so we've got a little for loop because we're filling it in. And this time our index, we're referring to it as C, short for check. We set that equal to 0. As long as C is less than my checks.length, we can add to it and we can keep adding checks to our little array. So please enter the check amount. We read in the double value and we store it. Okay. Each time we go through here, C is going to increase and we will be filling in our array. Okay. And then once it's done, we are returning the checks. So it gets, that check array gets returned. Where is it? Right here. And then we are storing it in money array. So at this point, money array is full. Okay, it's full of checks. And we are going to calculate a new balance. So we take the balance and we pass that and we pass our money array, which is now filled in. We come down here and we're bringing in the balance and we are bringing in our money array. Okay, and you will notice that when we're done, we are going to return a double value because we're going to calculate what the new balance is and return that figure. Okay, so we do need to total up our checks. So we have a total check variable we set to 0. And then we got a little for each loop. And what we're going to do is go through that money array, and we're calling it my money down here. And we're going to retrieve every single value that is stored. Okay, and we're going to refer to those values using an M. Okay, so we're just taking the value that was retrieved and adding it to total checks. Okay, and for each automatically goes through every single element. Okay, so when we're done with the for each loop, we have added all of the checks. So we're going to display back to the user your total checks written are or equal, and then we're going to display out that total check figure. And then their new balance is going to be the balance they passed minus that total check figure that we calculated. And that is what we are returning. And that is returned to here. And we are storing that figure into balance. So now when we do the print balance, it is going to be different than it was before. Okay, now when we print the balance, it is going to reflect what our new balance is because we subtracted all the checks out. So now we actually could be overdrawn. The first time we went through, highly unlikely that we would be overdrawn because we typed in the beginning balance and we hadn't subtracted out any checks. So when we called print balance here, we should have had money. Okay, but when we call it here, yeah, we've written checks, they've been subtracted. So we pass the balance. We say your current balance is, give them the figure. And now if it's less than 0, we still print your overdrawn message, but it's more likely that they would be overdrawn now because we subtracted all the checks. Okay, and I've got some sample output there for you to look at. So that is arrays. And I will say a lot of students, it does take new developers a little while to get the hang of arrays. And that is why you guys have a little more time to work on this. And we have exercises that you guys will be working with. I do encourage you, though, to copy and paste these examples because you can modify them and kind of work with your own arrays, especially these little short ones. Okay, and you can actually change this. Let me get one of my, I have some junk projects here. Not that the examples are junky, but let's see. Oh, hello world sounds like a junk one here. Student test. Okay, so this will run as is, but this is the kind of thing that you guys should play with, especially if, you know, you are not real comfortable working with arrays. And you can literally do arrays on whatever you want. So you could do a membership array, members. Okay, and you could actually make another array. You could say double dues. Okay, and Visual Studio is pretty awesome because you can see it's kind of guessed, and all I have to do is press tab and it enters that for me. Okay, and then to fill in the string array, we can run through here. And actually, no, we'll do a separate one. And you can change this. I can call it fill name. Fill dues. And let's see. I'd actually like to fill them in at the same time. But you haven't learned that yet. So here we will just keep it like this. And this is going to be double. Oh, I know a tricky little way we could do this. I think we're going to do it up here. Instead of filling in the whole, I think it's better to do it up here. Because then we can fill them in at the same time. So we're going to get rid of our methods. And so we are going to say sure. The name. Okay, and I's are indexed, so we're going to put this right into members. Whoops. Line. All right. And then let's do console right line. Okay, and this is going to go into our dues array. So we'll set that equal to, this is going to be a double value. We gotta do double dot parse. And there we go. And we'll get rid of this. So that will fill them in. Okay. And then if you wanted to print them out, we could do another for loop, or you could do for each. And so we'll do string, but with the for each, we can't really print out both. So I think we're just going to do a for loop because we're working with multiple arrays here. Size less than size. Right line. Come back here. String interpolation. Oh, let's see. Number. Is it I or yes? We're still using I. Just say dues. And if we wanted this to be formatted, we can do that. And this is dues sub I. We'll do a little shortcut for the formatting. There we go. Let's see, did we do that right? Size and size. All right, let's throw our closing brace that somehow got lost back in there. Okay, we'll go ahead and run this. I'm not going to enter too many. How many items would I like to enter? Probably members would be better, but here we go. Enter the name, Fred Flintstone. Enter the dues. We'll do his buddy Barney. And there we go. Okay, so I do encourage you guys to kind of play around with this because that is how you learn.